welcome to Slash Forward. I had no idea I was going to be tying my brain up in knots this week, but here we are watching The Others, starring Nicole Kidman. For research purposes, be sure to hit the like button when we reach the part of the movie where you figured the whole thing out. Let's get to it. We open on a shriek of anguish, the result of an unseen nightmare. With nary a moment to compose herself, Grace is then descended upon by a party calling to take audience with the lady of the house. They introduce themselves as Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle, and young Lydia, the mute, and they've come to inquire about the need for quick replacements of the service staff for the house who left the prior week suddenly and with no notice. Grace quickly takes control of the situation and shows them around while apprising them of the daily schedule. The primary rules: never open a door without closing the prior door first, and try to keep the noise to a minimum due to her migraines. After sending off Mr. Tuttle to tend to the grounds, she intends to introduce the ladies to her children. But first, she likes to set the mood right, and then carefully awakes them for their morning prayers. She then presents Anne and Nicholas, who we learn both have the sun sickness and are to be kept in near total darkness at all times. In a trial by fire, Mrs. Mills is immediately tasked with serving up breakfast, while the children ponder whether Daddy will ever be returning from the cursed war. Then the children argue about whether or not Mommy went mad the other week when everyone left. You know, typical kid stuff. Mrs. Mills is then confronted about the fact the mail did not go out the prior week, which means her posting for help was never published. Mrs. Mills admits that they had just arrived looking for work and came here because they had served the house years before. She wanted to tell her, but Grace was just so bossy she was never able to get a word in edgewise. They then pop out of the darkness, and Grace warns about the children's strange and fantastical ideas, something she is not a huge fan of, preferring to stay grounded instead. To that end, she transitions to the morning's biblical lessons, in which she admonishes Anne for rationally concluding she would have lied to the Romans to keep her head affixed upon her shoulders. But you see, that lie would then lead to an eternity in limbo,
where it's very, very hot.
She then splits them up for their next assignment of imagining how awful infinity must be. Then, as Grace attempts to pump Mrs. Mills for the juicy gossip about Lydia's muteness, she's distracted by the faint sound of wailing in the distance. She runs off to find soft young Nicholas, but he's all good. So she goes to Anne instead, who is similarly not crying. Anne suggests it was the boy Victor, who had been there, but she told to piss off so she could finish her studies. She then goes into great detail about him and the others who have been viewing the house, the sort of fictional flight of fancy for which her mother has no tolerance. But when she goes to leave, an open door. You know what that means. Haranguing the help regarding the dereliction of their duties, of course. At night, Anne shows Nicholas that Victor has been opening the curtains like a mischievous little devil. Unfortunately, he refuses to show himself. She then has an unnerving conversation with him, but we never see her mouth to verify if she's the one making the voice. And before we can find closure, Nicholas loses his nerve and calls in Mommy, who's driven to her wit's end. As they argue about the ethics of keeping up this story, Anne demonstrates that she has a greater mastery of the scriptures than her mother, resulting in a surprised Pikachu face. As punishment, she's forced to recite passages from the Bible, which really just kind of widens the gap further, and starts to creep out Mrs. Mills. We learn the punishment was to do this until she's ready to ask the Virgin for forgiveness. To that end, she's been on the stairs for 3 days now. Grace then turns her focus on Lydia, who pounds around unnecessarily whilst cleaning, which Mrs. Mills agrees to address with her. But then, when Lydia seems to take a running slide into a bookcase, Grace decides to take matters into her own hands, but is startled to find both ladies outside her window. But so then who? She asks Anne, who doesn't know what to do because she's already being punished for telling the truth. But she ends up pointing Mother in the direction of the junk room. She finds the room to basically be their ghost storage and pokes around, although it's not clear what she expects to find. She's startled by whispering, but then its sources go off in various directions. Grace now insists the house is occupied, and Anne shares a helpful picture she made of the family she's seen. She then orders the help to go with her to methodically clear the home, room by room, drawing curtains and checking every bare corner. All Grace manages to find are some crusty old photos. She tries to match them up, but Anne's artwork is just not good enough. Also, when she shows a photo album to Mrs. Mills, it's identified as the Book of the Dead, photos of the deceased meant to relieve guilt by hoping the souls live on through the portraits, so it's unlikely their intruders are contained therein. As a result, Grace takes to lounging with the shoddy nearby and invites Mrs. Mills to share stories about her prior experiences at the house. It was a good time for her, but the family moved away, and the house eventually seemingly just became vacant. Grace goes to apologize for being so hard on Anne, which counts even if the recipient is unconscious. Nick then inquires about when Daddy's coming home from the war. Grace suspects it'll be soon, but then goes to have a cry because, in reality, the war's over and she's had no word of his whereabouts. But she's snapped out of her melancholy by music emanating from the piano room. She ventures in cautiously, ready to bust, but finds no one there. The door seems to have a curious tendency to close on its own, and sometimes slam in your face. She calls down Mrs. Mills for the keys and enters again to find the piano undone. She is convinced now that there is some diabolical entity of unrest within the house, and is disturbed to discover that she gets no resistance from Mrs. Mills, who wholeheartedly believes in stories of the beyond. She thinks that sometimes the worlds of the living and the dead get crisscrossed, an aberration that spits in the face of God, which Grace can barely tolerate. Having been so long now since having a visit from the priest, she requires his company and blessings. On her way out, she tasks Mr. Tuttle with searching the grounds for gravestones. Instead, the help gets together to tut-tut about their mistress's eccentricities.
When do you think we should bring all this out into the open?
You crusty old codgers, what are you up to? Out on the road, the fog grows so dense there's little chance of finding her way to town, or anywhere for that matter. But through it all, she finds herself face to face with her Charles, and she gives huge props to Jesus for making this good fortune come to pass. They make their way back to the estate, surprising everyone. The children are delighted at their father's return, but despite the general excitement, he does not come across as enthusiastic as they. At dinner, they try to delineate between the baddies and the goodies in the war, and the kids discover that with Charles now returned, Mom is back on her "there are no intruders" thing. Not expecting this twist, Anne pushes too hard while looking for affirmation, and gets sent to her room, but along the way she's intercepted by Mrs. Mills, who admits that she's seen the family and she's just biding her time until Grace sees them as well, promising there are big surprises on the horizon. She then goes out to the groundskeeper's shack where she relays this change in Grace's attitude to the others. This poses a problem in regards to the enacting of their agenda, whatever that may be. The next day we find Anne outfitted in her special communion dress, like a perfect little bride of the Lord. Grace leaves her in her room to enjoy some solitary playtime as she goes to see if she can convince Charles to try to just stop being so sad. She returns to have Anne remove the dress and notices that she's aged significantly since their last visit.
What have you done with my daughter?
Are you mad? I am your daughter.
But she knows better and thrashes that old bitch, only to discover that that gnarly old bitch was Anne the whole time. In the shock of this moment, Mrs. Mills sees an opportunity to try to interject and guide the situation. However, this breach of the hierarchy of authority snaps Grace out of her stupor. She returns to her room where Charles begins to ask her about the day the servants left, which Anne told him about. Grace doesn't give much detail other than to insist she would never hurt the children. Then Charles claims he only returned to say goodbye because he has to get back out to the front lines. Despite that whole matter of the unconditional surrender, Grace laments that she pushed him away by being insufficient to satisfy his needs, and they find themselves momentarily rejuvenated in the fleshly delights. But when she wakes up, he's gone again. Before she can say boo, Anne wakes up screaming. When Grace arrives, it dawns on her that the sun has risen and the curtains in their room are completely gone. So she wraps her children in her jacket and tries to find a safe spot in the house. Eventually, she gets a window blocked off with a chalkboard. They seem to be okay with regards to the sunlight, but are then devastated to learn that father has left again. Grace does her best to accost the help about the matter of the curtains, but everyone seems to be playing it very coyly, and also suggests that perhaps the children may have grown out of their photosensitivity. It's not clear what they're playing at here, but Grace confounds whatever plans they may have by drawing down on them, taking the keys and forcing them to leave. They head out, indicating it's now time to bring their plan to fruition, as Grace goes searching for those damn curtains. This goes on well into the night. Bored with waiting, Anne decides to take a downspout to ground level to go look for her father, and Nicholas follows along. As Grace searches the servants' quarters, she finds an entry for the Book of the Dead that contains her faithful servants. And at that same time, Anne has stumbled upon the gravestones, which are adorned with their names. Recognizing now that they are ghosts, she convinces Nicholas to run. They meet up with Grace in the front before locking themselves inside the house. Mrs. Mills tries to tell Grace more about the house now, and confirms they just want to learn to live together. She points out that even if they leave, the intruders surely won't. So why don't they all just hang out and see about making it work? Meanwhile, the children are hiding away in a wardrobe upstairs when they hear a strange breathing sound and are confronted by the scary old lady. Grace hears their screams and runs up to find some hep cats hanging out around a table and asking the children about what happened. When the matter of a pillow is brought up,
"Is that how she killed you?"
she starts asking them about why they choose to remain in the house if dead. The easy answer here is that they are not dead, which they insist emphatically, and they try to bang up as much noise and commotion as possible in order to convince them, at which point the perspective is flipped to reveal the table group is performing a seance, and are the victims of a fairly thorough, albeit unintentional, haunting by our protagonists. They determine that they shall dispense from the grounds with their son Victor first thing in the morning. Now that the veil has been pulled back, Grace recounts her memory of the aforementioned pillow incident, in which she killed her children before turning a gun on herself out of guilt for what she did. This resulted in a sudden and unexpected return of the children, who she found playing in their room as though nothing happened. Now that she gets it, Mrs. Mills offers some tea and reassures her that intruders will come and go over the years, and they may not even always know they're there, but they can remain in the house forever. This hits her ear nicely, and she commits to claiming the house as their own, so they can enjoy the sunshine whiling away in limbo for eternity. The Others really hits different and is a very enjoyable mystery. It has great atmosphere and is highly rewatchable even if you know how it turns out. There's a lot to dig into to see how it feels after knowing the big reveal. Little details like Anne turning into the old lady, which actually represents her possessing the medium in the world of the living. There's also Charles's wayward, shell-shocked soul randomly wandering around and occasionally finding himself back at familiar locations like his old estate, among many other things. Before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my donors memorialized in the Hall of Headshots. As an FYI, I have a website set up where you can support the channel through donations or merch. Any donation unlocks uncensored movie reviews of Life Force and Under the Skin, with others to be added over time. If you enjoyed the video, I'd love for you to become a part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.